just another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time. Just be respectful, dudes, and never learn.
Welcome to the Baltimore Bureau podcast. Today is June 15th, Friday, June 15th. And today we're going to be, as usual, talking about all of the stories that we've done as a Baltimore Bureau this week. I'm Dharna, as usual, and I'm here today with Khalilah.
Hello.
A relatively new addition to the Real News' Baltimore Bureau, but already in just a couple of weeks seems to be ruffling some feathers, which is amazing.
Score.
Yeah. And actually, let's start today by talking about, a big project that you've been working on for the past few weeks. This past week, we had a gubernatorial debate here at the Real News Network where we actually focused on education and specifically the Kirwan Commission. So for those who don't know, could you explain what the Kirwan Commission is?
Sure. So the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education is also known as the Kirwan Commission. William Britt Kirwan is the chair of the commission, and he is charged with moving the agenda forward with that commission. It has about 24 members. The members are appointed by the governor, senior leadership in the Maryland legislature, and by a couple of partner organizations, like the Baltimore Teachers Union has a representative on the commission.
Right. And actually, one of the people who's running for governor is on the commission as well.
Exactly. Senator Rich Madaleno is also on the commission. So the commission is charged with doing two things. One of those, I'm all over the place with these headphones and my earrings,
You're
so
good.
leave that off. One of the things that the commission is charged with is taking a look at the funding formula for how schools receive money from the state of Maryland. I think it's 23 LEAs in the state of Maryland, local education agencies or school districts. And they are also charged with creating policies to reform education in the state of Maryland to make sure that students have access to high quality education. And the panel was targeted at having candidates for governor really articulate more clearly what their policies are or their policy recommendations are for students from cradle to career in Maryland, but also to really drill down to how they would expect to fund education in Maryland if
definitely.
they intend to adopt the recommendations from the Kirwan Commission.
Right,
So,
which say that there's a huge, even just an adequacy gap in funding for city schools.
Right.
So
the
state
Kirwan
schools.
Commission picked up on that, but there has actually been an adequacy gap for some time, starting first with the Thornton Commission
That's right.
what was established in 2002. And so advocates have been really pushing for a funding formula to be adopted that could be protected by the state. Around 2007, when we had the Great Recession, while the Thornton dollars were kicking in, there was a big drop-off and plateau in funding. And so school systems have not been being properly funded in accordance with the Maryland Constitution's Article 8, the education article, to make sure schools are adequately funded. And so the Kirwan Commission has an opportunity now to reverse that, but also to make sure there are systems in place to hold elected officials accountable,
Right.
and district officials accountable for both allocating the right dollars for children and also making sure that the policies for how the dollars are spent allows for equity in access to opportunity across the state. So
I think it's pretty clear to everyone who's watching or listening why Khalilah was the host of this gubernatorial and the lieutenant gubernatorial debate that we had here. Let's take a look at or listen to a little explainer pack that you voiced about the Kirwan Commission, which we showed at the panel, and then we can take a look at some clips from the actual town hall too. You can watch the whole thing at therealnews.com, but let's take a look at some clips.
you may have never heard of it, but the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, also known as the Kirwan Commission, is arguably the most influential body in Maryland regarding the future of public education. Named after its chair and Chancellor Emeritus of the University System of Maryland, William Britt Kirwan, The 24-member board is tasked with creating a funding formula and policy recommendations that could impact public education for generations. The board itself is comprised of educators, politicians, and representatives of educational organizations, all selected by a variety of stakeholders, including the governor, the Maryland State School Board, and legislators. The commission's findings, along with recommendations, was scheduled to be released in 2017. However, the board has yet to release its final report, instead offering a preliminary summary in January 2018. From the preliminary report, we know a big part of the Commission's work is looking at how schools are funded. Article 8 of the Maryland Constitution requires the establishment throughout the state a thorough and efficient system of free public schools, and to provide by taxation or otherwise for their maintenance. The current Commission is building on the work of the 2001 Thornton Commission. Thornton was created after Maryland entered into a consent decree because courts found the state had failed its constitutional mandate to adequately fund Baltimore City public schools. The consent decree was a partnership between the city and state to work together to improve Baltimore City schools through new funding and leadership. Under the Thornton recommendations, school funding began gradually increasing statewide in 2002, but tapered off after the Great Recession of 2007. A state report found this caused Baltimore to lose out on over $250 million in 1 year alone. Critics say Baltimore schools have been underfunded by $3 billion since 1996. Consultants found Maryland needs to spend $2.9 billion a year more to adequately educate its students. The Commission hasn't come up with a price tag yet for the policies they will propose, but that's one of the things it's still meeting to figure out. There are currently 5 working groups hammering out the details for Kirwan's major policy recommendations. Expand access to universal pre-K to all 4-year-olds, low-income 3-year-olds, and all special education students. More resources for at-risk students. Commissioners found that as a state, Maryland spends 4.9% less money on poor districts than wealthy ones, the 15th most regressive funding system in the nation. Have a more rigorous teacher training and certification process. The recommendations also acknowledge the need for a more diverse teaching workforce. Just 25% of teachers are people of color compared to nearly 2/3 of the student body. Curriculum should be able to support all students to be college and career ready by 10th grade and provide resources to those who fall behind. And finally, the state needs to increase accountability for high-quality schools and strengthen governance, including in the implementation of the Commission's proposals. In 2019, the Maryland legislature will make decisions about the Commission's recommendations, determining whether they will be implemented and how they will be funded.
And I want to pivot to Wesley Hawkins, who's a graduate of Baltimore City Schools. He's also a member of Baltimoreans for Educational Equity and a founder of the Nolita Project.
How you doing to all candidates? So my question is, so how do you deal with the trend of high poverty schools continue to hire least qualified educators and principals dealing with high levels of turnover?
Ben, that's for you.
You know, my parents met as teachers at the old Harlem Park Junior High, and my mom noticed when she was there that, you know, when they came to desegregate the schools, they were very selective about the black students that they chose to desegregate white schools. But my mom, my dad, who was a white teacher, realized that they hadn't been as selective about the teachers that they brought in to desegregate the black schools. And there's been a long trend of us, quite frankly, not making sure that every school has a high quality teacher. And that's part of my passion to make sure that our schools are finally fully funded, because we have to be able to recruit and retain the best teachers. And quite frankly, we need to make sure that the shortage of teachers of color and of male teachers of color is addressed head on, because we know how transformative that can be for young people. We've known for a long time that until we fully fund our schools, every other theory of education is just a theory, including integration itself. And it's time for us to fully fund our schools and to have high standards for our students, but also with the teachers that we're recruiting, how we train them, how we retain them, how we lift them to the next level in their profession.
Thank you. Senator Madaleno?
Thank you for that question. It's interesting. People may be surprised to learn that my children are both African American. And last year, in an interesting experience for me, my daughter had her first African-American teacher in the Montgomery County school system for math, and her math grades soared. Now, she was a great teacher, but it's not lost on me, she was a great teacher who was also a person of color, and my daughter bonded with her. We must bring more teachers of color into the school system. We're going to do that by investing in the schools of education at our HBCUs as part of solving the issue around the consent decree and the argument about the disparity with the funding for the HBCUs, as well as part of the Kirwan Commission, to make sure we bring in high quality teachers of color. We can marry these two and get them done, and that will be fundamental to my administration and certainly to the implementation of the Kirwan Commission.
So I'm so glad I went to Morgan State University, so thank you for injecting that in. Alec?
Yeah, you asked a very specific question, so I want to give a very specific answer. One of what I thought were one of the best recommendations in the Kirwan Commission is that we create career ladders for teachers. So rather than, just saying you're a teacher, a first year, second year, third year, but one of the ways of keeping outstanding educators in the classroom is you can certify at higher levels. You can become master teachers and other such things. If you create a career ladder for educators to help keep them in the classroom, and then create incentives, including financial incentives, for master teachers and more accredited teachers to teach in schools with higher concentrations of poverty, just put a thumb on this scale to try to drive the most experienced, most accomplished teachers into the schools that most need them.
So I'm going to take a point of personal privilege and not allow this commentary around HBCUs to go not spoken to. Because although I am proud of Morgan State University, I'm proud of Coppin State University and Bowie State University and University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And we know there is a lawsuit pending where the state is seeking to settle the score for the ways those schools have been underfunded and undersupported. So I'm going to offer 30 seconds to a few of you if you want to speak to that further. Ben?
When I was 23 years old, I was in Jackson, Mississippi, organizing students because the governor was fixing to turn a public historically black college into a prison. And I was there as part of a family. My grandma's granddad was born a slave. He co-founded Virginia State. My family's attended Morgan and worked there for generations. I'm a trustee of Morehouse now. And it's great to hear everybody saying that we need to stop the lawsuit and get creative about what we should do with the funds that the schools deserve. But it's kind of too late at that point to be talking about innovation. You've got to first deal with the basic equity issues, make sure that the schools are restored for all the funding that they were denied for years, and then put your ideas for innovation on top of that. Because when the foundation of the school has been eroded by chronic underfunding for decades, we have to restore that just on general principle, and then bring our best ideas for how we build Morgan and Coppin and Bowie and UMES on top of that.
Thank you. Brandon?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We have to do that. We know that the lawsuit is laughable. We know that Governor Hogan offering $100 million to erase decades of underfunding is actually a joke, and we should laugh at him for doing that. But also, we know that we have to make those investments. We need to repeal the lawsuit, but we have to make the innovations in those programs, making sure that Coppin, Morgan, UMES, Bowie have programs that no other state university has so that we can build them up and build those people. When I was fresh out of college, I worked at Coppin State, helping them to build a Coppin Man program and seeing the potential of those students, but they still are not afforded the same opportunities, and we have to make sure that that happens.
Mr. Jaffe?
First of all, teachers are my heroes. We have to pay them a better salary. They must get more money. That's the bottom line. I also want to comment about blaming Mr. Hogan. Last time I checked, the state legislature is made up mostly of Democrats. Most of the governors have been Democrats. I'm no big fan of Mr. Hogan. In fact, I think I was the first one who called for his impeachment. But to be fair about this, both parties are at fault here.
Thank you, Mr. Jaffe. Liz, HBCUs?
I just want to make 2 points. One is there's been a tendency to provide capital dollars to the HBCUs instead of operating dollars. And it's sort of a way of like buying an additional year, buying a few more years. But we have to commit to capital dollars. I mean, it's been talked about how woefully low the number has been by Governor Hogan. And that's low for decades and decades of underfunding. The other thing, though, is colleges, and I will call out Morgan State again, just because I live nearby and I know very well the work they're doing. They're serving students. They're going out of their way to serve students from, really challenging backgrounds, students who need extra support. And so we should be pouring more money into programs at HBCUs generally, and also some of the specific programs at Morgan, because of the special work they're doing, including remediation for some kids who come from really, tough high school experiences. They're performing a special role in the state, and we need to recognize that.
Thank you. Rich?
If you want to end the lawsuit, elect a different governor. Because it's the governor who has directed the Attorney General to do the appeal. And we can have a governor who pulls back on the appeal and actually puts the resources in order to undo, at least starting to undo, the decades of underfunding and the disparate treatment of the HBCUs. It's going to take time and effort, but it's something that has to be done. And I was just trying to bring up that I think that the best way to start to be innovative is start that innovation in the schools of education that propel them forward to help propel a more diverse teaching workforce for all the young people of our state.
Thank you. I think what I heard from most of you is that you agree more dollars need to be allocated and you commit to that. And as an educator for almost 20 years, I'm clear that all of the families who may have had limited means that show up in the ways that they can to schools would appreciate those extra resources. And with that said, I want to move on to social media and the questions we have from the interwebs. And first we have a question from Paul. We'll start with you, Ben. And Paul is asking, do you support a millionaire's tax dedicated to fund education? Because all the other suggestions are essentially a sales tax, which means working people pay the most.
Yeah, I may be the only one up here who said quite plainly that I believe that we should tax the 1% more, and we should use it to increase funding for education. Yep.
Thank you. Anyone else?
And by the way, I've had a year or two where I've been in the 1% tax bracket. You know what? Those years, I could totally afford it. It's fine.
Yeah. Anyone else? Would you support a millionaire's tax instead of sales tax types of funding resources?
You're making the assumption that we do not have the resources already to put into the school system in order to fund the formulas. We don't have $2 billion today to start it. But that ramping it up over several years, which is inevitably the approach that's going to be used.
What's our surplus? We have a $500 million surplus
resources.
now.
Hold on. Encouraged to tax the 1%.
We have the resources. In fact, Ben, I'm the only one that has a record of actually voting for a tax increase up here. And in fact, we have a tax rate for people above $1 million. In fact, above $250,000 and $350,000, which is already amongst the highest in the country. We have an incredibly progressive tax structure, and we should be proud of that in turning in the resources to get it done.
Ben?
I'm simply thinking it should be more progressive than it is. And
just because you want to tax wealthy
people,
hold
on, let's let him finish.
No, absolutely not. Again, Rich, if you had done this earlier, I would have paid it. What I'm saying is that we're at a point where the gap between the haves and the have-not is getting so big. And education is our great equalizer. And we have to be willing to say to those who have the most, you can pay a bit more so that our society can get stronger. If we don't have the courage to take on the 1%, how are we ever going to actually get the billions of dollars that we need, not just through K through 12 education, but to stop the student debt crisis? We've got to be willing to put it all out there on the table, and the 1% could certainly afford 1% more.
Alec, you wanted to jump in as well?
Yeah, what I would simply say is that one of the things we need to recognize is we have a $43.4 billion plus or minus budget right now. And if we make education sacrosanct, fund education first, and then fight over everything else thereafter, instead of saying we want to do something new in education, we need to go find new dollars for it, no. Let's take the recommendations that are in the Kirwan Commission and let's start with education. And then if we want to, then with our other programs, whether it's lacrosse camps in Baltimore County or whether it's transportation programs, whatever it is, let's start with education. Let's fund education first.
Okay, yep. So that was a town hall that we had here this past Tuesday at the Real News Network. Again, you can check out the whole thing at therealnews.com. Khalilah, you were an amazing host.
Thank you.
Again, like within the first 2 weeks of you being here. You're just like an amazing host. You commanded that panel like with so much authority.
Been at the rodeo a couple times before.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's safe to say that you probably know at least as much about these recommendations as any of the people running for governor. So
at the
very least.
Yes.
So, and after the panel that we had, Jessel, one of our reporters, Jessel Noor, was actually able to speak with one of the candidates, Alec Ross, and they talked about a bit more about education and how to fund public education in Maryland, but also they talked about the need for more jobs. They talked about some of his climate policies. He had some strong words for Governor Larry Hogan about the rain tax, the tax that was put on developers to pay for stormwater management. It's a pretty broad range of topics in a short time.
Yeah, I like this idea about having a green bank.
Yeah,
and really making sure there are resources available to protect communities and use dollars that are going to go. Again, it's that access to opportunity in an equitable way he spoke to. Even on the panel, it was an interesting time. And we got to topics like we saw in the previous videos as well, related to HBCUs being fully funded, and talked a little bit about the millionaire's tax. And you saw that exchange between Ben Jealous and Rich Madaleno again, related to, it being okay to say if you have more, you can give more.
Yeah.
Right? And I think Alec spoke to that as well in his interview, and it was interesting to see that interplay because I didn't see his interview until after the panel.
Right.
But he raised those points, and I that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I think the Green Bank also is interesting. It's something that sort of sets Alec Ross apart a bit, and makes sense with his background as like sort of an innovator in technology. He was sort of, they call it the tech guru for the Obama administration. So yeah, I guess see what you think. We'll take a look at this interview now.
Yep.
So I'm here with Maryland gubernatorial candidate Alec Ross. Thanks so much for joining us at The Real News.
No, it's good to be here. Thank you.
So the most recent poll done of candidates, Democratic candidates in Maryland, you polled last, but there's still a large number of voters that are undecided. What makes you the best candidate to take on Larry Hogan in November?
I'll beat him. Look, I mean, over 50% of likely voters still haven't decided who they're going to vote for. I think if you put one of the sort of tired old politicians from the sort of merry-go-round of Maryland politicians, they're going to lose. People are sick of this same old, same old. I bring a fresh perspective, new face, new ideas, and that's what I think it's going to take to beat Larry Hogan.
So Larry Hogan campaigned and successfully repealed the so-called rain tax. And he's doubled down on that move since the flooding, historic flooding that devastated Ellicott City last month. What would your approach be to both development in places like Ellicott City, but as well as addressing issues like climate change that we know impact the severity of storms like the one that poured a ton of rain on on Ellicott City, and actually on Ocean City just this weekend as well?
Yeah, look, so first give Larry Hogan credit. He's a great politician, bad at governing, but great at politicking. Even calling it a rain tax, it's not a rain tax, it's a stormwater remediation fee, the purpose of which was to actually contain the effects of exactly what just happened in Ellicott City. Look, on this issue of climate change, I think that sometimes change has to come incrementally, but other times I think incrementalism is like literally killing us. And on issues of climate and environment, I think we need a leader who is not going to sort of nibble at the edges of the challenges, but be really bold, which is part of why I want to bring real clean energy infrastructure into the state of Maryland through the creation of the kind of green bank that's worked really well in other states. I want to bring a $1 billion green bank into Maryland so that we can actually produce clean energy and have a more sustainable future.
So this year, Larry Hogan worked with Democrats to pass some tough on crime legislation. We know there's a record homicide rate here in Baltimore. What's your take on improving public safety in places like Baltimore and across Maryland?
Look, I think that we are not going to be able to arrest our way into a safer future.
I think that's sort of a backwards approach. And again, part of what drives me crazy about career politicians is they're afraid to do the really difficult stuff that works over the long term. If you want to keep people out of the criminal justice system, invest deeply in our schools. If you don't want 16, 17, 18-year-olds in the criminal justice system, invest in universal pre-K. Bring counselors, psychologists, and social workers into our schools. And so where I have a real hard time with the crime bill that went through Annapolis is if you really want to solve the problem, then let's invest in these young people and in the communities so that they have a future that doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in crime.
You talked about education. Would you also support the public sector creating jobs, something like happened in the New Deal, to put people to work in East Baltimore to West Baltimore, where the private sector hasn't stepped up for decades, even though they've gotten billions in tax breaks?
No, it's exactly right. I mean, look, the green bank that I want to create, I think we can take our goals on climate and environment and our goals on inclusion and job growth and bring them together. I think that the creation of a green bank will create basically the market conditions with government money to enable substantial investment so that people can be building solar panels in Maryland at a good in a good union wage job. So for part of how I want to address the issues of both climate and environment and inclusive job growth is through this green bank.
So you are a former Baltimore City public school teacher. You're an alumni of Teach for America. Larry Hogan says Maryland schools don't face a crisis in funding, they face a crisis in accountability. He supported deregulating charter schools. He supported possibly deunionizing them in Maryland. The charter school lobby says Baltimore and Maryland as a whole has the worst regulations on charter schools, but public school advocates say they're the strongest regulations so Maryland's avoided the scandals you've seen in other states with financial mismanagement and other scandals. What's your response to Larry Hogan's public education policies?
So what Larry Hogan really wants to do is privatize public education. I mean, he is a devotee of Betsy DeVos, and that's what if he wins re-election, trust me, we're going straight to the Betsy DeVos model. He's already been pushing us there. Once he's reelected, there will be no checks against him. My view is that the current charter law works. We do not have for-profit charters. I think that there is accountability so that charters have to meet standards that traditional zone and magnet public schools have to meet, like the ones that my kids go to. My younger two kids go to Baltimore City public schools and they go to the neighborhood zone schools. I think that the charter should have to have the same kind of governance and accountability. So I'm not in favor of privatization. I'm not in favor of the DeVos model of public education. And thank you for saying, yeah, I come at this as a former public school teacher married to a public school teacher with 3 kids in the public schools. So I'm all in on this issue.
So that was our reporter Jessel Noor in an interview with Alec Ross, Maryland gubernatorial candidate in the Democratic primary, which is fast approaching now in just a couple weeks. He is lagging in the polls. I mean, as I'm sure everyone listening to this knows, it's a pretty head-to-head race right now between Rashern Baker and Ben Jealous. So we'll see what happens. But I guess a lot of people are still undecided.
Polls are always so relative. Most of those undecided people are not at all undecided. But
that's a good point. And who knows what the polling size is?
Yeah. So, he is right now polling last, I think. And raised the issue that even though there are 20+% undecided voters, that half of the voters overall are undecided, which, I do think that it's great that people kind of fight it out until the end. But at some point, I really wish that the field would narrow because people really need to be prepared to stand behind a candidate on the Democratic side, and if they're ready to push against Hogan, you can't do that when there are 6 or 7 people that you are trying to filter through, or who are really diminishing, the capacity to stand behind 1 or 2 candidates.
And I think in the coming days we will see people. I mean, Valerie Irwin, who just who replaced the late Kevin Kamenetz in this election, just dropped out earlier this week. I think that we will start seeing people maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe a little bit more.
Maybe. She was not actually on the ballot.
Yeah, that's because he was on the ballot, which is also crazy to me that we can't reprint ballots at this time in history. But,
yeah. I think that we really want to make sure that, just like what we were attempting to do with the panel, that people have enough information to really make good decisions. And when you have candidates who are so close to the election staying in, it can pose a challenge for people to really get behind someone who can win in the fall. I certainly wouldn't have been saying this 6 months ago, 8 months ago, like, get in there and fight it out. We want to make sure we have choices between our candidates. But
now that early voting has already begun. Yeah.
Stand down, friends, stand down.
And we were saying that there's some candidates who have pretty similar platforms. I, this week, spoke with Wagner Raja, who's actually the only woman left in the gubernatorial race for Maryland, and the first gubernatorial ballot in history to include 2 women of color, which is just seems impossible to me that that's never happened before. And you and I were talking about how similar her policy platform sort of seems to Alec Ross's.
Totally. Yeah, you can kind of, as they do in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world, you can blind score their resumes, and they are almost the same person.
Yeah. And also, both of them worked in the Obama administration.
Yeah.
She was Michelle Obama's policy director. So, and
neither of them have executive experience.
Yeah. Neither of them have held public office, right? So.
Yep. So I know they would say working in the executive branch gives them executive experience, or that they were responsible for very large budgets, which is a little shady because they weren't actually personally responsible for those budgets. So, they're very similar, and I think they both probably have something to contribute to policy making and legislative advocacy. So I hope, presuming they don't win, that they continue to stick with us so that we can stick with them and see, how they can really contribute to the state, even if it means running in the future.
So let's take a look at the interview that I did this week with Wagner Raja. We're now just weeks away from the Democratic primary for the Maryland governor. Election day is June 26th, and early voting starts on June 14th. 8 candidates are running, and now 2, Rashern Baker and Ben Jealous, are going head-to-head in the polls, contending for first. Today, we're joined with the only woman left in the race, Wagner Raja. Krish is the former policy director to Michelle Obama. She's a former State Department official, and she's here with me in our studio today. So thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So, Krish, we were speaking a bit off camera about some of your campaign videos that have gone viral, including one that features you breastfeeding, which people are a bit up in arms about, and another one where you're reading angry tweets or mean tweets that tell you to go back to India or question why voters would vote vagina. You're lagging in the polls a bit right now, but a lot of voters are still undecided. So talk about why you're the best person to defeat our incumbent, Larry Hogan.
Sure. I mean, part of it is a lot of kind of what you've noted, I think, is actually connected to being a woman, meaning that my campaign has been focused on a range of issues connected to my experiences here growing up in Maryland, but also working as Michelle Obama's policy director. I think I'm the most qualified because I'm not a career politician, but I have had executive experience at the highest levels. I managed a $51.6 billion budget while I was at the State Department. I ran multi-billion-dollar initiatives for the First Lady. But ultimately, I think what voters care about is that they've heard a lot of politicians come into an election promising the moon and stars and failing to deliver. I think people want to know that they have someone there who is one of them, who's going to be fighting for all of us. And I think that that's what our campaign has been about. I've been called Donald Trump's worst nightmare in article after article. But for me, it's not just about being anti-Trump or anti-Hogan. It's about putting forth an affirmative, positive agenda. And so for us, that's really focused on education, revitalizing our economy, protecting our environment, supporting working families, addressing, crime, making sure we provide healthy, clean air, safe drinking water for our families, et cetera.
So I want to go through and unpack, I think, all of those. And we can start with the environment. We recently saw devastating floods here in Ellicott City and parts of southwest Baltimore. And of course, when Larry Hogan was first running for governor, he ran on this platform that centered what he called the rain tax, or the the mandate that developers would have to put money into stormwater management. How would you distinguish yourself from Hogan here? How would you sort of work to prevent these kinds of extreme weather events destroying communities and work to fight climate change?
Yeah. So I think the distinction between me and Governor Hogan on this issue is that I'm not going to play politics. Hogan, his rain tax resonated because people perceived previous administrations as nickeling and diming folks. And I get that. I understand why people feel like we have a high cost of living, we have a high tax burden, and that is something that I do want to address head on, because our government doesn't operate as efficiently as we need to. At the same time, the truth is that floods are natural in some ways. But when you see two 1,000-year storms that have happened within less than 1,000 days of one another, clearly there's something bigger at issue. So part of what I want to address is the fact that, we have to have better stormwater management. When you have, large developments, when you pave over Mother Nature's natural defenses and create roads or parking lots, what essentially you're creating are slides that become the conduit for the volume and velocity of water that we saw in Ellicott City, here in Baltimore City, Baltimore County. This past weekend I was in Ocean City. They saw the effects of it. Last week I was in Frederick. And so this is where you realize this issue is going to come up time and time again. And the kind of political pandering is not leadership. And the fact that Governor Hogan has doubled down on this issue is, again, where I think he is so far out of sync with what people are feeling and where we need to go.
But then, so how would you fund something like a stormwater management system, if not with something like the stormwater development tax?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I hope that people will tune in to our policies on the website, Krish for Maryland or krishforgovernor.com, because we actually have a very elaborate flood plan. To your specific question about how do you actually pay for this, part of it is making sure that as developments are created, we've got to make sure that the externalities, basically the effects of these developments, are included in the pricing of that construction. And so what I mean by that is that if you're going to create a development, there have to be requirements for the floodwater management that are the effect of that construction.
And you've also supported the 50% clean energy by 2026 and 100% by 2035 here in Maryland. Advocates have been working on this move to renewables for a long time. But talk about, again, how you would implement some of those plans. What does that actually mean for the state of Maryland?
Yeah. Again, this is a sharp contrast with certainly Governor Hogan, but I also think that we have, one of the most bold, if not the boldest, visions on this issue in the Democratic field. I believe you cannot set a target that isn't achieved during your administration. So when Governor Hogan says, I'm going to get to 40% by 2030, that basically means I'm not going to do it during my administration. It's why we have set a very clear 50% clean energy by 2026, meaning the end of my second term. What we're going to do is we're going to invest in offshore wind, solar energy, geothermal, but also energy efficiency. Sometimes I hear people say, my husband will say this sometimes, he runs the National Wildlife Federation, that we need to eat our energy efficiency vegetables before we enjoy our offshore wind, solar energy dessert, because it's not as sexy to talk about energy efficiency, right? But it's actually a social justice issue. When you think about the fact that the families that are burdened by high electricity bills are the families who would benefit from better windows, but we don't provide the financing knowing that it pays for itself if we provide that initial financing is where we're focused on both making sure we invest in offshore wind, solar panels, on real opportunities across the state, knowing that geothermal is something that we're seeing in buildings, in homes, but we could definitely increase the usage of it. But also acknowledging that if we invest in energy efficiency in our schools, that we could reinvest that to rebuild our crumbling schools, that there are ways in which we can be much more innovative and smart about energy.
And switching gears a little bit, another, of course, issue that disproportionately impacts communities of color, communities living in poverty, is education. You've said that this is, in some sense, the center of your campaign, and Governor Larry Hogan has actually said that the problem of funding in Maryland is not actually one of funding at all. It's a problem of accountability from schools, from teachers, from education officials. How do you respond to that? And then also, more specifically, how do you, or how would you support the findings of the Kirwan Commission? I mean, your running mate Sharon Blake is a former teacher herself.
Yeah, great question. Education is the reason I'm running, and there are reasons for why we are called the education ticket. I'm the only candidate in the field who's the product of Maryland public schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. I'm the only candidate who's the daughter of 2 Baltimore City public school teachers. My father, who retired last year, was the oldest public school teacher in the state of Maryland at the age of 80. He had taught 37 years here in Baltimore City. My running mate Sharon Blake had taught for 43 years here in Baltimore City. She was the head of the teachers union. And this is where we've got to revamp our schools, knowing that it has to be about policies from cradle to career. So part of that is investing in universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds, knowing that that divide between the haves and have-nots starts even before our kids go into school. But part of it is fixing the funding inequities. When Governor Hogan says it's not about money, that's curious because, he cut Baltimore City funding by at least $41 million in direct funding. The Kirwan Commission estimates that we're underfunding Baltimore City schools by about $400 million. He's put $1.4 billion of casino and lottery revenues intended for our schools. That was the promise that we made. He's put that into other purposes. And so it's easy to say that it's not a funding issue when he's cut all of this funding and used that money for other purposes. This is why I sometimes talk about him as a reverse Robin Hood. He steals from the poor and he gives it to the rich. And this is where, not surprisingly, our schools have gone from 1st to 7th. By some measure, I actually saw that they went from 1st to 11th. And this is where, it's got to be, when I say cradle to career, it's got to be about rebuilding our crumbling schools. I know when I was in Woodlawn High School, I was learning in so-called temporary trailers, trying to learn in sweltering heat, freezing cold, and those trailers are still there, 20 years later. My father and my running mate both taught at Frederick Douglass, where our kids were literally freezing in classrooms. But it also has to be about investing in science, technology, engineering, arts, math, financial literacy, civics education. But it's also got to be about knowing that our schools have become community centers. The number of kids living in poverty in Maryland has doubled between 1990 and today. Michelle Obama was one of the first people to kind of professionally teach me common sense principle, which is no child can give their teacher their full attention on an empty stomach, which is why we want to provide free, hot, and healthy breakfasts and lunches. And I'll kind of conclude with this piece, I want to make sure that when our kids come out of school, they are either career ready or college ready. Some number of our kids are not going to go to college, and that's fine. But we've got to destigmatize the trades. Welders, electricians, plumbers, those are well-paying jobs. And we've got to prepare our kids when they come out of high school to be able to go into those jobs immediately. But for some kids who do want to go to a 2- and 4-year college, we got to make sure that financing isn't the reason that they don't. It's why we are offering, and we will guarantee, free community college, debt-free tuition at our HBCUs, our historically black colleges, but also 1% student loans, because a Maryland student right now has, on average, $30,000 in student loans.
And again, how will that free college be paid for? What kinds of revenue streams would you use to fund that?
So for free community college, we've got to be innovative here. Community college is a good example of where I believe the intersection of our economy and education exists. So when you look at Pittsburgh, Kalamazoo, Michigan, you'll see cities that have introduced public-private partnerships to pay for these smart programs. You basically have private employers, knowing that a lot of these kids are the pipeline for their jobs, who actually finance to the tune of 70 million, 100 million, these kinds of programs. And so this is where we're going to partly fund this through public-private partnerships. But part of it is also that we've got to revamp our budget. Joe Biden used to say this in the Obama administration when I served. If you want to know your values, look at your budget. We've got a 1950s backwards budget here. What I mean by that is we spend about as much on prisons and policing as we do on higher education. We spend twice as much on roads as we do on public transit. We spend much less on early childhood education as other states. And so this is where there's an opportunity, because community college, universal pre-K are some of the smartest investments we can make.
So I'm hearing you say this, and I think, you know, a lot of folks here in Baltimore might be skeptical of the idea of funding this with public-private partnerships, because this city has put, you know, billions of dollars into public-private partnerships, but frequently folks will wonder about, you know, the accountability to the city and to the people who are supposed to be benefiting. So what kinds of measures could you put in place to ensure that, you know, it's actually the people who are supposed to be benefiting from these who are?
And so let me also just clarify. So, you know, a substantial part of this will be government funding, in the sense that we can't rely on private partnerships, and we certainly will not be dictated to in terms of private partners funding. My point is that once we have constructed exactly the kind of program that we want to institute, there are opportunities of where private partners can partner with us, knowing that these are smart investments. So for us, you know, part of how I will fund my education policy is making sure that the $1.4 billion in revenues goes kind of going forward to where it was intended. Part of it is actually making sure that we are investing, you know, funding, you know, from the legalization of marijuana into education, knowing that it is the smartest investment. And the truth is that this strategy we have of not going down that road is untenable and unwise. Part of it is also making sure that we do think creatively about public-private partnerships. So a good example of the kind of approach I would have is based on my career. So when I led and launched Let Girls Learn, this was an initiative that the First Lady had focused on making sure girls got middle school and high school educations. So what we did was I took that from a seed of an idea to bringing in 7 federal agencies and $1 billion of government funding. And that's how you make sure that the anchor is strong, right? That you're not getting dictated to by private partners, that the accountability exists. But what we did was we leveraged the government funding by bringing in over 100 private partners and over $3 billion of private capital. And this is what we can do even with universal pre-K, because we know that for every dollar we invest, we have a $38 return on that investment. $19 between kindergarten through 12th grade, and another $19 of savings once that child graduates from high school. And that's where I just think that we've got to be smarter about how we put you know, funding into certain programs.
So Baltimore public schools, Maryland's public schools have, you know, been the focus of a lot of this education policy, but Maryland also has a really interesting charter school program. We have some of the most regulated charters in the country, some of the only unionized charter teachers. What would you do to preserve those sorts of regulations for charters in Maryland?
Yeah, I mean, look, the truth is that we're seeing innovation in both our public schools as well as in charters. And I mean, no one should be against innovation, right? If we can facilitate laboratories of experimentation, knowing that there is a lot that is going wrong with our schools, but there are also smart programs that work that should be scaled. And so my approach is, you know, I don't take a hard and fast rule on any of these strategies. If we do have hard and fast rules, the truth is we will lose a generation of kids. Kids who frankly remind me of myself, in the sense that, you know, I went from some struggling schools, Edmondson Elementary, Johnny Cake Middle, Woodlawn High School. But I went from Woodlawn High to the White House because there were some smart programs that we invested in. So when I was in high school, we had Governor Schaefer, who invested in a magnet program at Woodlawn High. And the idea was to make investments, seed investments in struggling schools. And so that pre-engineering math science program is what sparked my interest and led me to study molecular biology at Yale. And so my goal is, let's try to foster that kind of innovation. Let's try to make strategic investments so that regardless of what zip code, what district a child grows up in, they have a basic shot to realize their potential.
To again switch gears, we're seeing a bit of a crisis in policing here in Baltimore. You know, just last week, these two officers from the Gun Trace Task Force were sentenced to a combined 43 years for racketeering, for overtime fraud, for robbing drug dealers. And your brother, through Wagner Raja, is actually running for state's attorney. But talk about how you, as governor, would sort of distinguish yourself from the tough on crime programs that Larry Hogan has actually worked with some Democrats to pass. What would you do to sort of fight this crisis of policing?
Yeah. So there's a range of problems that are at the root of this issue. Part of it is Governor Hogan has not accepted that these failed strategies of mass incarceration, zero tolerance, mandatory minimums, the racist war on drugs, that they're failing. And so for me, it's about refocusing our attention. It's about recognizing that there has been a school-to-prison pipeline. A lot of those kids are kids who, you know, Sharon, my running mate, and my father taught, and they're smart kids, right? They want to do the right thing. But when you see an at-risk youth, you got to make sure that there's an intervention early on. It's why even at the White House we had a mentoring program, and it wasn't to identify the valedictorians of classes. It was to identify kids who were smart, but who had, you know, mental health issues, family problems, you know, financial troubles. Who had gotten in trouble prior. And you realize that you can turn around a kid's life by intervening. It's why Operation Safe Kids was incredibly effective. And you saw Governor Hogan defund that and only start to refund it when he held hostage the program by saying, I'll only refund it if you address mandatory minimums, which again, we know that that's not the way to address this issue. Part of it is realizing that, you know, addiction is not a crime. It's a disease, and it needs to be treated as such. And so this is where, you know, obviously you asked the budget question. This is where it's a win-win, where our moral interests align with our monetary interests. To put a prisoner, you know, behind bars costs us $38,000 to $45,000 a year. To put that person into treatment costs $5,000 to $10,000, which means that for every person we put into a Baltimore prison, we could be paying for 30 families affordable housing. We could be paying for 37 GED courses for individuals. And so that's where, you know, these strategies are losing. But when it comes to policing, this is where we've got to revamp the system. The fact that the overarching policies that Sharon and I have put out, one is on community policing, so you'll again be able to see that on our website. Another is on safe schools and safe streets. When it comes to community policing, it's about making sure that our law enforcement look like, live in, and work with our communities, meaning that 40% of our officers are African American, only 20% are women. That's obviously very different than the demographic that they patrol. Likewise, only 20% of our officers live within the city's jurisdictions. And that's where we've got to recruit from local communities. We've got to incentivize police officers engaging with boys and girls clubs, working with recreation centers. We've got to invest in the kind of community patrolling task force, those opportunities, because that's how we'll get the better results. But the other piece of it is when I talk about safe streets and safe schools, look, it's great that we have focused on mass shootings. But the truth is, here in Baltimore, we have a mass shooting every month. And that's where we've got to address that, you know, this gun violence has to be addressed head on. And so for us, that's about addressing that, you know, safe schools is not just an issue of guns, it's an issue of public health. It's about working with law enforcement, and it's about instituting smarter gun violence prevention policies, like making sure that every gun is registered and insured, just as we do with our cars. It's about making sure that the age to purchase a gun is 21, just as we have for other rules. It's about making sure that we're, arming our teachers not with guns, but with guidance counselors, with counselors who can address the fact that, many of the problems that, we are addressing are mental health ones.
You talk about the need for more police of color, more police from the communities, but here at the Real News, we've actually noted that some of the police in the Gun Trace Task Force are people who are from the communities that they're serving. So let's talk a little bit about some structural reforms. Like, you support legalizing marijuana for recreational use, but do you believe that people currently incarcerated for marijuana-related crimes should be pardoned? And then, for instance, in Oakland, there's a program where those incarcerated for marijuana are the first in line for dispensary licenses as sort of a form of reparations. What kinds of steps like this would you take to bring justice to those incarcerated for marijuana?
So we're gonna, what I plan to do as governor is to take a hard look and look at kind of the current population and how to kind of address in a, just way the fact that, it has been a racist war on drugs, simply put. And so it is going to be about not just addressing the incarcerated population, it's got to also be about the fact that there are a lot of collateral consequences when someone comes out of prison. For a simple offense of possession. It's got to be about expungement of their records. It's got to be also about making sure that there is a pathway to reentry. There is no reason for why, with our incarcerated population, the ability to vote is taken away. Just 2 days ago, I was having a conversation with a former felon, Julius, who, incredibly bright, incredibly articulate individual, who complained legitimately about the fact that, he's had a number of job interviews. When his criminal record comes up, it's the end of the conversation. And so unless our strategy is we're going to lock folks up and throw away the keys, what we do does not make sense. In Maryland, the recidivism rate is 40%. In Baltimore City, it's 73%. And so we've got to figure out how, when people are in prison, they are either going to become better criminals or they're going to become better people. And so I think that there are ways in which we could invest to make sure it's the latter rather than the former. The fact that only 0.001% of incarcerated individuals have access to vocational or GED training makes no sense. And so that's where I think that there are some real opportunities.
And then finally, as we've noted a couple times, you're now the only woman running for governor of Maryland, with Valerie Irvin backing Rashawn Baker. And your ballot is actually your candidacy is actually the only one in history to ever have 2 women of color on a gubernatorial platform. But talk a little bit about how you would use that platform as governor to uplift women, people who are sexual or gender minorities, people of color. Talk about how you would go beyond representation to really uplift those who are seeing the worst of these effects.
In the great state of Harriet Tubman and Barbara Mikulski, the fact that out of 14 federal and statewide offices, so that's the 8 congressmen, 2 senators, and the 4 statewide officials, we have not a single woman in any of those seats. That's unacceptable. And, as the only woman in this race, it is reflective of where Maryland is, in the sense that we come in 50th out of 50 when it comes to child care subsidies. As of this past legislative session, we were still debating rapists having paternity rights. Maryland was one of the 6 states that still allowed for that. And so that's where you realize that 0 has an effect. When you think about what that means, you realize that there is an incredible opportunity this election cycle. When people said to me, as I was, contemplating Sharon Blake, someone who has lived the struggles of a lot of Maryland families, she committed her life her career to empowering youth here in Baltimore City. And people said, well, you can't have an all-woman ticket, and you certainly can't have an all-woman of color ticket. I said, why not? How many times have we had the exact opposite, and no one has ever complained? And this is where I think that we have an opportunity to actually put our policies, to put our priorities, to put our funding into the things that matter, to address the fact that here in Baltimore we have the highest number of deaths due to air pollution, that here in Baltimore we have skyrocketing crime. But you know, though we are never going to say, thank goodness Donald Trump was elected, I have never seen the electorate more mobilized in the recent past. The last time I saw this to be the case was when my old bosses got elected. And so this is where I do, I'm incredibly inspired and excited about this election, because look, we have gained momentum over the last few months because as people have heard our message, they've gotten excited. We have won forum after forum. We have been, you know, I've been called out as sort of the standout in debate after debate against the quote-unquote frontrunners, with nearly half of the electorate still undecided. For us, the point is that it's not that people hear our message and it doesn't resonate. It's that, you know, people are still being introduced to our campaign. We just started one of the biggest campaign ad buys of any of the candidates this week. And so the polling is only reflecting what's happened in the past. Just as people are tuning in, is when they're hearing kind of our campaign, and so we're very excited. But it's also that, you know, 2018 is the year of the woman. You know, just yesterday we saw in Virginia, out of the six out of the 7 elections in Virginia were won by women. That 7th race, there was not a woman running in it. And so this is where, when you realize, you know, to your first question of what, you know, allows you to stand out in this race, it's that we actually have a competitive edge against Governor Hogan. The conventional wisdom is that no man can beat Larry Hogan. Well, I'm no man. And that's important because when Democrats have picked up seats against incumbent Republicans in this past year, 61% of those seats were won by women. And that's where I think that we have an opportunity. Texas, Idaho, Virginia, those were elections where women, even though they were outmatched in terms of financing, even though the polls had them significantly down, time and time again, race after race, you saw women won because people are sick of the same old, you know, politics as usual. And people are sick of the old boys club. And that's where I think people are looking for a new generation of leadership, and that's what we represent. And I'm excited to, you know, kind of look at what's to come and what's going to happen in the next week and a half, because I think that we're going to surprise a lot of folks.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens, I guess, and keep us posted on the campaign trail.
Absolutely, we'll do. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being with us today. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. Okay, that was a gubernatorial candidate for the Democratic primary, Wagner Raja. Was cool to get to sit down with somebody for a whole half hour and ask them so much about so many different parts of their policy platform. And again, I think that she has lots of similarities to Alec Ross. They had very similar responses to being asked about Governor Hogan's rain tax and how to fund stormwater management. She had some interesting things to say about funding public education. She's running with a teacher actually on as her lieutenant governor, gubernatorial candidate, I guess is how you would say that.
Yes.
Candidate for lieutenant governor. And one thing that I thought was interesting is that she didn't seem shocked to get some pushback on the idea of needing to develop more public-private partnerships, because I was like, you know, here in Baltimore, we've seen so many millions of dollars invested in public-private partnerships, and lots of people are skeptical because there's not a lot of ways to hold corporations accountable for actually providing some public good.
And there's not actually been a lot of evidence that the public has benefited from the public-private partnership.
Yep, and right? Tons of evidence that the private has.
Well, exactly, right? Like that, you know, especially when you have entities not paying taxes, that could contribute to the general good.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's a mantra that gets repeated over and over as the answer, when the other answer could be, I'm just going to prioritize education.
Yeah. And it's speaking of taxes, it's a little bit frustrating, I think, to hear people have to so closely toe this line of like, yes, we need more money, but I know that nobody wants to pay more taxes, so we can never increase taxes on anything. Like, our tax system is already great. It's just like,
that's not leadership.
Yeah, and also like, come on. First of all, probably half of you don't actually believe that. Like, you're just trying to be bipartisan and please everyone in some way.
Right.
And also, like, then okay, if it's not through taxes, give us some specific ways that you're going to be funding these projects. So, but yeah, she's a very easy person to talk to, which is nice.
I mean, she definitely seems not only relatable, but like someone who is actually listening to you when they're talking. But again, there's this kind of we've got the answers, young innovation kind of ethos that both she and Alec have that I think sometimes can really look past people who are directly impacted and grassroots folk. Like, yes, you have some knowledge about how people's lives are being disrupted or experiencing systemic inequity, but you don't have that lived experience. So what ways can all of the candidates, how many do we have now? 8?
Yeah, 8. Oh my God, 8 candidates.
How do any of you really take the steps to show that you are particularly open to people with lived experiences coming to the forefront and having a seat at the table to suggest policies on the front end, as opposed to you kind of, like you said, sitting in or resting on your laurels to please everyone, as opposed to being someone we can say that is a strong leader, and they were willing to take the risk to say, we probably need to tax more people, or, you know, some of us really have more that we can share. So,
and you know, actually find ways to be accountable to those grassroots leaders, to people who are actually facing these lived experience or making, you know, policy proposals or suggestions. How do you actually hold leaders accountable once they're elected? I mean, it's great, and everyone likes to meet with grassroots movements and movement leaders and everything before the election, but how many people are actually coming back? And
yeah, that's what I was getting at, that, you know, it sounds good and it sounds like, you know, but what actually are you going to do to make that a part of your practice? And I think, you know, I want to encourage people to go back and watch the panel. Again, it's on the website, therealnews.com. You know, there was a piece in there where people started talking about accountability. One of the guests asked the candidates, I want you to tell me how I'm supposed to hold you accountable and what does it look like? And I think they gave some really strong answers. So
definitely. And, you know, speaking of the folks who are, you know, organizing on the ground, the grassroots movement leaders, this is week 5 of the new Poor People's Campaign that our executive producer, Eddie Conway, has been covering every week. There were some arrests this week.
Yeah, today, I think. Was it today or yesterday?
I think.
Reverend Barber.
Yeah, and Reverend Liz Theo Harris was arrested at the Annapolis action this week. They had some interesting things in here to say about the fight for better public education and then higher education as well. So yeah, we can take a look at that video next.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Eddie Conway. On Monday, Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris, the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign, were arrested on Capitol Hill. They were set to speak at a forum on inequality and poverty in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. In Annapolis, for the 5th consecutive week, the Poor People's Campaign has been holding a rally.
We've been here for 5 weeks. This is our 5th week, isn't it? Yeah. We got 1 more week, and we haven't heard a word from the governor.
And rallies have been held all over the nation in 37 other states. In addition, a rally was held in downtown Baltimore, organized by the Fight for 15 and the Poor People's Campaign.
It's time to take back power for working people. The theme for this week again again is everybody's got a right to live, because your financial situation should not determine if you have housing or health care or food, and if you can take care of your family, right? Y'all know we live in one of the wealthiest states in this country. And it is a damn shame that people who work 40 hours a week are still living in poverty, right? Exactly. So we got to do something about that. This is a joint event between the Poor People's Campaign and the Fight for 15 campaign. Woo, for the Poor People's Campaign. So the Poor People's Campaign has been participating in 40 days of action in 35 states and in D.C. to change the narrative of blaming poor people just for being poor. Hey, who's that? Who's that guy right there? Who is that guy right there?
So I'm not giving these workers fair pay. They don't deserve fair pay. They don't deserve a $15 an hour minimum wage. If they get a full $15 an hour minimum wage, I don't get to keep this. I make my money off the backs of these hard workers. If I pay them a fair wage and give them good benefits, that means I don't get to keep this.
When workers' rights are under attack, what do we do? When workers' rights are under attack, what do we do?
We have the power!
I'm a part of the Baltimore Algebra Project, and we were invited down here by the Poor People's Campaign to kind of bring in that educational aspect to it, especially because we're a youth-run organization.
In higher education and higher levels, such as the state level, too many decisions are made without youth, right? Right. Where are the youth? Yes. Seriously, I mean, we have to hold ourselves accountable. Yes. Where are the youth? Yes. We need to be in the forefront of this movement. Our voices need to be heard, especially when we're talking about educational equity.
We do have programs like Youth Works in Baltimore City, but when it comes to living wages, those don't pay enough, especially when we have students that are providing for their families, when they don't have parents in the household that have adequate employment opportunities. And, you know, summer isn't just the only time people need money, right? Like, we need to make sure that this is a sustainable movement. So that's why we are here today, to make sure that aspect is heard.
Now, how worthy is this math class if it's not teaching me how to pay my bills before I'm off on the streets enjoying those junky thrills? How worthy is this English class if there's no class discussion, not teaching me that if I disagree, there's a need for a social disruption? Now, how worthy is this chemistry class if I can't use what I know about bonds to bring people together? How worthy is this government class if what I'm learning can't help me change the minimum wage? I'm not 20 years of age, but I have 20-year-old responsibilities. Now, this wage I'm given will keep me in this low-class cage. Just know that this school situation brings me more than just rage.
23.4 million of Black people, 60% are poor and low income. Did you know that 37.6 million of Latinx people, 65% are poor and low income? Did you know that 7.8 million of Asian people, 41%, are poor and low income? Did you know that 66.2 million white people, 34%, are poor and low income? 250,000 people in the U.S. die each year because of poverty and low income. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Well, we're here because we've been supporters of the Fight for 15, and because we're trying to support the woodwork, trying to continue to push for a raising minimum wage. And I'm also here collecting signatures for an initiative called Better Budget Baltimore that we're working on, which is to change the charter so the city council has more equal budgetary powers with the mayor. Currently, the mayor sets the budget. All the council can do is cut the budget. They can't move money around. They can't add money. They can't reset priorities. And so we want a more democratic process for the budget. We think this is a start.
Okay, so you can do that by petition here in Baltimore?
We have to get 10,000 signatures verified as registered voters in the city of Baltimore, and we can get it put on the ballot for the fall elections.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay, and so how are you doing so far?
Well, we're only a couple weeks in, so we're probably only 1,000 or two on our way towards our goal. We of course have to get a lot more than 10,000 to make sure we have 10,000 verified.
That's bad. Okay.
So, but we'll make it. We have till early. We have till like the middle of August.
Good afternoon. Y'all too quiet for me. Y'all real quiet. What do we want? 15. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? 15. When do we want it? Now. There we go. I couldn't hear y'all when I was coming down the street. Okay.
We're fed up and we are tired of having to make decisions about whether these kids are going to eat a meal or if I got to pay a bill, just like I said. And it's a shame that we're working, and we work hard. Mm-hmm. And I work myself in a healthcare facility, and I still can't make ends meet. And I'm not alone, and we're going to let people in Annapolis know, and we're going to hold our delegates and all our candidates accountable.
Okay. So that means in the November election? Is that what
the primary election? We're going to do early voting. We're going to Annapolis every time we get a chance. Every time we get a chance, and we're going to keep on being spoken. We're going to keep on speaking out until something is done. And then that's the beginning. And then we're going to 20.
Okay, that was executive producer Eddie Conway on the Poor People's Campaign. If you're just listening to this, I encourage you to go on the site and either watch the Baltimore Bureau podcast show, because you can do that now every week, or just take a look at these videos on therealnews.com. Some beautiful visuals in there, and also it's nice to put faces to names. You can see Khalilah on the Real News Network.
And Dharna on the Real News Network.
And we're going to, I guess, close out this week with an interview that another fairly recent addition to the Real News Network, Mark Steiner. I feel like it's a media badge of honor in Baltimore to produce a show with Mark Steiner, so that's cool. Who spoke with two doctors who were actually laid off from, I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, a pediatric hospital in Franklin Square that's closing. It's pretty devastating. I would encourage you to, if you're not going to now, to go back at some point and listen to this entire interview, and he'll have another one coming up soon with Margaret Flowers. And Annie Chambers, who are two advocates who have also been pushing for, justice for the people who will be affected by this hospital closing.
We continue our look today about what happened at Franklin Square Hospital in Baltimore with the MedStar Corporation closing an entire pediatric unit and what it has meant. Today we have a different guest talking about a different aspect of what that means for all of us, because it's probably coming to a community near you, no matter where you live in this United States. One of our guests this hour, the Reverend Annie Chambers, is the Green Party's Lieutenant Governor candidate here in the state of Maryland. Yes. She is an advocate, a patient at that hospital, and an advocate organizing people around MedStar to fight back on the closing unit. Good to have you with us here.
Thank you.
And with her is Dr. Margaret Flowers, who in past years has been a guest on my other show many times. Good to see you again, Margaret.
Great to be here.
And Margaret is now the co-founder of the Maryland Healthcare for Human Rights and coordinator of Health Over Profit for Everyone, which is fighting for single payer across this country. Good to have you both with us. So let's talk a bit about, first of all, what you began organizing in the wake of the closing of this pediatric unit. So, and let me start with you.
Well, I'm, I guess, a career organizer, but
yes, you are.
when I went to one of my apartments, that's how I found out about it.
When you say one of your apartments, because you live in public housing and you're organizing
apartment.
I think it's apartments.
Yeah,
right.
I live in public housing. I, live right in the heart of the communities. But when I went to my apartment, and there were people in my doctor's office, crying. And these were, often we go there, we socialize, we talk, everybody knows me. And they were telling me they couldn't come to see the doctor anymore.
And your doctor was Dr. Dillon, who was on our last segment.
Dillon, yes.
Right.
They couldn't come to see Dr. Dillon anymore because they were told they were sent a card and saying that they had to, could not see him anymore. He wasn't on the rolls of their healthcare providers, which was MedStar. And they didn't understand it, and I didn't understand it, and you know, people were saying, well, maybe Dr. Dillon really don't, you know, really want, but that wasn't the case. The case was that they had taken all of medical care and Medicaid patients and away and sent them to the, I call them the little basement clinics where, you know, we have had bad experience. When I say we, even myself, have had bad experience in these clinics where there's no real workup of you when you go in there. You can, you know, I have experience that I can give you of patients that have, you know, went there with a heart attack, and I'm one of them in one of these clinics. And they never told me I was having a heart attack. I wound up in the emergency room with fluid done, you know, covered my body, covered me. So there's such a thing as patient rights, Bill of Rights. It's like we don't have sense enough or know enough to know that we can, you know, say no to this. They just, you know, have been bogarting people, so bullying people. And now my thing is, and along with others, is to organize people and to say that we, you know, we won't allow this to happen to us. Most people can get a second opinion. If, you know, we can't even get a first opinion. You're going to accept whatever they tell you and leave. You know, you can have diabetes, which is very high in poor people's community, heart conditions, you know, strokes, and all of these things happen daily to people because we trying to survive. All these things are upon us. We don't have proper stores. We live in food deserts, so people tend to eat whatever. And so we're fighting to make a change in our health condition, and they have just turned it back, all of Obamacare. And for MedStar to come in and do what they're doing, we won't accept it. So yes, we are organizing against them.
So Margaret Flowers, you've been involved in this struggle around single-payer health care for a while now. Mm-hmm. So how does this all fit in? I mean, what just happened at MedStar in terms of kind of your analysis of what's going on in the country with the corporatization of medicine and the battle around single-payer? How does this all fit in together?
Well, and what Annie outlined and the doctors Reed and Dillon spoke about in the last segment really shows that we have a, you know, the only industrialized nation in the world that has a market-based system that treats healthcare as a commodity and not as a public good or as a human right. And so we're seeing hospitals, well, we're seeing giant medical corporations, and MedStar is one of them, that are really doing what's called vertical integration, where they're just gobbling up hospitals, long-term care centers, laboratories, rehab centers, physician practices. They have their own insurance. They make their own products and devices that they sell to their own corporations, in this huge consolidation of the medical industry. And with no regard for the patient, if some sector of that is not making money for them, they just get rid of it. So what happened at Franklin Square with the pediatrics also happened there with the obstetricians. They've also closed down, you know, psychiatry departments, you know, essential service kind of departments. And what's interesting is it's being done in a very discriminatory way. So at Franklin Square Hospital, half of the pediatric population they serve were Medicaid patients. At Union Memorial, Dr. Dillon's patients that were MedStar patients were Medicaid patients. They reassigned all the Medicaid patients off campus to these basement clinics, but the Medicare Advantage patients, which pay more, they kept them on campus. And so I think you remember the days, or know the stories, Annie, I know you know, the civil rights time when hospitals didn't serve the community because of your skin color. Well, now they're not going to serve the community because you're not a wealthy enough patient to be in their hospital. And that's where we're going with this whole
So when you say basement clinics, what do you mean? Annie used a word, you just used a word. What do you mean by basement clinic?
Well, you know, so Medicaid, which is the public health insurance for poor people, Most of our Medicaid now is privatized. It's run by private health insurance managed care organizations who contract with the state.
Even though it's a federal government agency and it's a federal program.
It's a federally funded program that's run by each individual state. That's how it's different from Medicare. It's really interesting because when they passed Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, it was supposed to be a single system so that it could be expanded into a national system. But Wilbur Mills, who was the Dixiecrat,
from Arkansas.
Yeah, he was the head of the Ways and Means Committee. He put the poison pill into it. He called it a 3-layer cake. He created Medicare in 2 parts at the federal level and Medicaid run at the state level, and that kept it as a fragmented system that couldn't easily be integrated. It also meant that at the state level, southern states that are less likely to be concerned about the health of their population, particularly their black population, were able to, exclude patients, whereas it's a whole other story, but the roots of this system
it's another story. Before I turn back to you, Annie, but it's another story. But I mean, it's a story that seems to directly affect what happened at this MedStar hospital, Franklin Square, because that's.
So what's happening now is that these Medicaid MCOs, managed care organizations, they get paid per patient. So the less care they give, the more money they have. And that's what these little clinics that set up and they contract with Medicaid, and their incentive is not to give care. Dr. Dillon was giving a lot of care to his Medicaid patients. He treats each patient the same no matter what their insurance is. So he was losing money for MedStar. And what's interesting is that Washington, D.C. actually kicked MedStar out of their Medicaid program because they had a high rate of denials, which was almost twice as high as the other Medicaid providers. So Medicaid patients would go in for care, get the care, and MedStar would say, we're not going to pay for it.
Let's talk about this in terms of Franklin Square Hospital and the MedStar system. You just said, Margaret, a moment ago, that Washington, D.C. kicked MedStar out of the Medicaid program because it wasn't servicing the patients.
Right.
So what are our options here? I mean, what are you all demanding? What are our options here in terms of all that?
Well, the options are that the patients can themselves disenroll for MedStar and become straight Medicaid patients. Now, medical care does say, I think, that you have to be in a provider. Now, Margaret and them are being very nice. But when you get into places like Total Health Care, Jive Medical Clinic, see, I'm just saying, I know I can prove what I say. When you get into those places and they are not giving you, they are trying to save a buck. You understand? These are the kind of things that is frightening for people every day, for people like myself who see people, every day that need health care, but we're being shoveled off to the basement clinics, and those providers does not provide for us or take care of us. We're saying we deserve health care just like anybody else. This is America. Besides that, we live in Maryland, one of the richest states in the United States. What's the third or second richest state in the United States? And we can't even get decent health care. That's a disgrace to this country.
So when you said earlier, Margaret Flowers, that D.C. closed down MedStar's right to see Medicaid.
Well, they were doing their contracts and they didn't renew their contract.
So what does that mean for us? I mean, how does that play out? How would that play out here?
Well, so this is what boggles my mind, because MedStar is buying up community hospitals, Harbor Hospital, Good Samaritan, Union Memorial, Franklin Square, there are, hospitals in the Baltimore area. And patients in those communities have always expected those hospitals to provide them the services that they need. And what MedStar is doing, and it's a nonprofit, so it pays no taxes, so that's a huge amount of money, is trying to push poor patients out, push out the unprofitable programs, and do more of cardiovascular, orthopedics, the procedures and things and surgeries, departments that would actually make them a lot of money. MedStar is not having a money problem. MedStar has, I think, looking back at some of their records at the end of June in 2016, they had $1.8 billion in assets. And then they had another $1.1 billion in long-term bonds, which are also tax-free. They're paying their CEOs $1 million to millions of dollars a year in salaries and bonuses. So this is not about, oh, we can't provide these programs because we don't have the money to provide them. They're choosing to put their money not into these services.
So when you were organizing these demonstrations, outside of MedStar and outside of your memorial, outside of your memorial and Franklin Square, which are both MedStar hospitals.
And Harvard, we're going to do what at Harvard.
So what, what are the demands?
Okay, yeah.
And what can actually change?
Well,
within the system we have now, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the state of Maryland were doing its job, it would be looking into MedStar and saying, you're a nonprofit. We expect you to serve the communities that you're in. You can't close essential services. I think that, we should be questioning why MedStar has nonprofit status if this is the way that it's behaving. I would say to MedStar, if you're not going to take care of the patients in your community, then you need to go elsewhere. These hospitals weren't owned by MedStar always, but this is the problem, and this is a national problem. There's an organization or a corporation, Deloitte, they do kind of business analysis. And in 2014, they put out a report that basically told the medical industry, either gobble everybody up as much as you can, or you're going to be gobbled up. And that's what we're seeing. We've seen this mergers and acquisitions that are way beyond anything we've ever seen in the healthcare industry before. And when a corporation owns the doctor's practices, owns the hospitals, and owns the insurance, they have all the power. They can say, well, you're a doctor, you're costing too much, so we're getting rid of you. This is not the way that it should be.
And that's not regulated at all by the state or the federal government?
Well, they own everything. So they're legally allowed to do this. They're legally allowed, as they did with Dr. Dillon. They dropped him without cause. They had no justification for dropping him from their insurance, but they are legally allowed to drop, physicians from their insurance without cause. So, as we know, most injustice is legal, right? That's how they get away with it. But the state should be looking into this. And my question is, what's going on behind the scenes here? Why aren't our state legislators up in arms about this? How much are they getting in donations from MedStar?
Right.
Something I'm sure you'll unearth.
Yeah, but one of the main demands that we have is that everyone should have a right to choose the doctors that they want. Everyone should have a right to choose the health care that they want, and that they would be treated fairly. We live, again, in America, and when I went to Cuba, I got some of the best health care I've ever had in my life, okay? And nobody was treated any different. Now, if they can do it in a place like Cuba, and point, to a third world country like Cuba, which I don't consider a third world country. I consider it a great place. But anyway, if they can do it, and other, countries, smaller countries can do it, why can't we do it right here in America? We should have decent health care. Greedy companies like MedStar should be put out of business.
And just in closing, what are your next steps?
Well, around the MedStar campaign, we are reaching out to staff at other hospitals to find out what their experiences are. We are connecting with more patients to find out what their stories are. Our next action is coming up on June 4th. And we're just going to continue building this. We're looking into their financials and trying to get as much information as we can. And we're going to continue to expose what's going on, because this is a symptom of a deeper problem in our country of treating healthcare as a profit center, as a moneymaker instead of a public good, something that everybody needs. And in the bigger picture, we're going to keep fighting for national improved Medicare for all, some type of single-payer healthcare system, because every other industrialized nation in the world has a universal health care system, and they spend less than we do, and they have better health outcomes. We're seeing our health outcomes deteriorating, and that shouldn't be happening in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So, but we're going up against the moneymakers, so it's going to be a fight. We're talking here to Dr. Margaret Flowers and the Reverend Annie Chambers. Good to have you both here in the studio. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you.
And we'll continue to follow what you're doing and
we're going to beat the giant.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching and listening as well. I'm Mark Steiner for The Mark Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network, and we'll talk to you all next week.
Okay, that was Mark Steiner in one of 2 interviews on the closing of a pediatric hospital in Franklin Square here in Baltimore. Go to therealnews.com. You can watch both of these interviews back to back, double feature if you're interested. Yeah, that's all we've got for this week, but stay tuned for next week. I think next week I'm going to be at a conference in St. Louis, but we might have Easy and Baynard back in the studio, and maybe we'll see Khalilah as well in the coming weeks. Yeah, I don't know. How are you feeling about your first couple weeks here at the Real News Network?
Awesome. It's an amazing thing to be able to help push forward voices of people who others refuse to hear. I hate to say give people voice because they have a voice. Yeah. Do you want to listen or not?
We just have the microphones, quite literally.
Yeah, literally. So it's been great, and the team here at The Real News is amazing. So I'm super grateful. You know, things can go left when you start a new organization, and very smart, very dedicated people, especially to the mission of Real News, to make sure that we have independent voices able to bring stories and ideas and facts, most of all, to people who wouldn't otherwise get them, or who might get them through a source that is bought and bossed as opposed to unbought and unbossed. So
wow, that's like a
right up my alley.
So honestly, we should just cut that and make that like a beautiful promo for us.
It's my philosophy. I'll say it again.
Oh. Why, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been amazing to have you here with us already.
You.
So looking forward to getting to work with you more. And I'm sure that all of y'all who are watching and listening are looking forward to hearing a lot more from Khalilah. We always close out with a song, and this week we were thinking about listening to some Dharna, who's an amazing 16-year-old rapper from here in Baltimore, who's actually in the public school system that we've been speaking so much about. If you like listening to the podcast, please do so every week. We do this every week, and you can listen on SoundCloud and Stitcher and all places that podcasts are found. And also, if you like the Real News Network, obligatory reminder, just kidding, that we are a nonprofit and we are only able to do the things that we do because of viewers like you. So if you like what you're hearing, go to therealnews.com/donate. All right, peace, everyone.
Give us a coin.
Give us a coin. Bye, y'all.
Dharna, yeah. Hey, box out, yeah. Box out, yo, I'm the baddest out the bunch, so you better mention me, boy. Get it stacked, rack it up, pack it up, then I blow it like Leroy. People told me I'm the OG, all these others is